primary sources on and to know exactly what happened there. And about 20 years ago, he and a team went out there and investigated and did some digging and found out a lot more about how the battle unfolded, and he's going to talk about that today. For obvious reasons, we've been taking closer looks this year at the revolution in South Carolina, and that will continue. This one is particularly interesting. Well, it's got the swamp fox, it's got Light Horse Harry Lee, and it's got a lady who was really ticked off at the British for throwing her out of her house, and that's key to the story. Looking ahead, we're taking a break in June from these lectures, so everybody can go to the beach or whatever, and I'm going to. And after that, on July 3rd, we're coming back strong with Mike Burgess, award-winning history teacher, who's spoken here several times before, is going to talk about the Declaration of Independence. We are going to further celebrate our nation's 250th birthday by having some exhibits and living history reenactors out in the atrium as you come in that day. So I hope y'all can come to that. If you want to keep up with other future programs, please make sure we have your email. The sign-in sheet is over there by the door on that table. So before you leave, if you haven't done it before, if you've done it before, we've got you, don't worry about it. But if you haven't, please leave your name and email address and we'll keep you posted. Now would you please welcome James Legg.
Thank you, Brad. Okay, how is my sound?
Good.
Good? Okay. All right. I first gave a version of this presentation 10 years ago in this room when we opened a Fort Motte exhibit across the hall where the photo exhibit is right now in the Gist Gallery. I've done it a fair number of times since then. This is not a significantly different thing, and I know some of you have heard this one before. I know you were here or somewhere else that I spoke. So there's not a lot of news here. This covers the work we did between 2004 and 2016, and we really have not done anything significant since then. We've done some work, but nothing that would change anything that's in this presentation. So we're not talking about an obsolete topic here. We'd like to do more work. My colleague Steve Smith is now retired, but he's game to do whatever. I have no intention of retiring until they carry me out of the Institute, so there's still room for additional work on this site. And when we get to the actual remains of the fort, I think you'll see what I mean. Now, I don't have time to do a lot of history here, but we need some context in the Southern campaign, and then we need a summary of the siege of Fort Motte, and then I'll jump into the archaeology. So, as we know, in late 1779, early 1780, a huge British invasion fleet began to arrive off of Charleston. And this was Sir Henry Clinton's invasion force to take down the Carolinas, basically. By May, Charleston surrendered to his siege operations, and the American army in the South was almost entirely captured. Virtually the entire army was in Charleston, and they were gone. So the Americans began to scramble in North Carolina to put together a second army. Here's Clinton and his formal siege map that was published at the time. Now, Clinton left shortly after the siege was over, and he turned over command to Charles Lord Cornwallis, who basically commanded the entire Southern theater after this until he left for Virginia in the following year. Now, Clinton and Cornwallis had a strategy basically a twofold strategy for subduing South Carolina and ultimately the entire Southeast. The first was to encourage and supply and command Loyalist militia in the South. So they spread out over South Carolina to encourage and recruit and organize the Loyalist militia, which they thought would be more than strong enough to hold the place once everything was subdued. The other part of their plan was to control the interior, and for that matter the coast, with a series of outposts. Now some of these were major fortified towns like Camden, 96, Augusta, and on the coast, Wilmington, Georgetown, of course Charleston. Savannah was still held by the British. And in between, there were a lot of smaller posts, which were basically designed to facilitate communications and supply to the interior. These were places where a wagon train from Charleston, for example, could stop over for the night in a safe location before they proceeded inland. So this map that we did for the exhibit, by the way, shows most of these posts. Some of the minor ones are not on here. Fort Motte is under the big red arrow. Fort Motte was not actually established until 1781, but there was a British post about a mile away as early as the summer of 1780. So the British, to a large extent, control South Carolina in the summer of 1780. Now, the American army that was forming in North Carolina marched south under Horatio Gates, by the way, the hero of Saratoga. They marched south in August of 1780. And of course, that army was destroyed by Cornwallis in the Battle of Camden. So in May and August of 1780, we have two large American Southern campaign armies, basically the Army of the South, is destroyed twice. So of course the Americans set about creating a third Army of the South immediately after the Battle of Camden. Cornwallis, meanwhile, went about subduing the interior and building these posts and so forth. Now, the campaign ultimately shifted to North Carolina for a while, and Cornwallis and the new American commander, Nathaniel Greene, maneuvered all over North Carolina and up to the Virginia border and back. They ended up fighting the Battle of the Guilford Courthouse, which was kind of a British victory, but it was so costly that Cornwallis decided he was not interested in playing that particular game any further. He decided to march to the coast. He marched all the way to Wilmington, and as we know, ultimately marched north to Virginia with his field army and ended up at Yorktown. So when Cornwallis left the situation in North Carolina, Greene decided to try to retake South Carolina. And his tactic was to go after these posts one at a time. Now these things were far enough apart, some of them were days apart, that they were not mutually supporting. They were sort of like fire bases in the interior, but they were not mutually supporting. So they were theoretically easy to pick off, and as things emerged, they were indeed fairly easy to take care of. There were a couple of defeats, like 96, but even that one worked out. In any case, this was Greene's strategy. Now he took one major shot at the major British field army that remained in South Carolina, which was under Lord Rawdon in Camden. This was the only sizable mobile British force outside of Charleston. And Greene made an effort to defeat Rawdon. That ended up in the Battle of Hobkirk Hill, which was, of course, an American defeat, but not a disastrous defeat. And significantly, Greene did not go back to North Carolina because there was no reason to do that. He was in reasonable supply. Rawdon was threatened. So rather than retreat, which would have been the fashion of the day, he stayed at Camden. He stayed a few miles outside of Camden and maneuvered around to several different locations, and Rawdon really didn't know what to do about it. So there is the threat of Greene's army at Camden facing the major British field army, and at the same time, Greene has subordinates and colleagues all over South Carolina who are going to begin to go after these local posts. Here's an engraving of what Camden looked like at the time of the British occupation. So we've got the village in the middle there with a palisade around it and all these little earthwork readouts. As I said, Camden was one of the 3 major interior posts. So this is a big logistical center, and there was always a substantial British force in Camden. Now, 2 of the people who Greene was able to enlist the aid of were Francis Marion and Light Horse Harry Lee. Marion, of course, had his militia/partisan command that had been enormously successful through the winter of 1780-81 and into the spring. Very successful, defeating small commands of British troops and rallying people in the northeastern interior of the state. Light Horse Harry Lee was a Continental Dragoon commander who had his own legion. Now, at that time, legions were basically combined arm units. They had cavalry, and they had light infantry, and sometimes artillery. He had his own Continental Legion. Now, these 2 guys teamed up, and their first target was Fort Watson. And this is an ancient Institute of Archaeology reconstruction of how that probably went. The tower there is an interesting feature. There was not one of these at Fort Motte, but we'll see the tower again at 96 if you get into the history of this campaign of the posts, the War of the Posts, as it was called at the time. So this was a successful siege. Fort Watson, of course, is on the Santee, some distance below Fort Motte. Fort Motte is just above the confluence of the Congaree and the Wateree. So here are some important features. Now at this time, ferries were tremendously important in the interior. So a lot of these interior posts had something to do with ferries because you had to control a ferry in order to move. In this case, it's McCord's Ferry. Now, the road up at the top there from McCord's Ferry goes all the way up, crosses the Wateree, and goes to Camden. The road to the south goes all the way to Charleston. So this vicinity was a good place for British troops to stop and spend the night or 2 nights or whatever. It was not important in and of itself, but it was a good way station, and it effectively controlled McCord's Ferry. So that's why Fort Motte was there. And as I said, it wasn't even there until shortly before the siege that we're talking about. The original British post in the vicinity was down here at Belleville Plantation, the Thompson Plantation, which is a mile or so away. We don't know why they abandoned that one and moved to Fort Motte, because it's actually further from the road, the Charleston-Camden Road. But in any case, that's what they did. And sometime in the late winter or early spring of 1781, the British fortified the new Motte Mansion that's shown here on the map. Now also take note of the little farmhouse there on the top end of the peninsula. That will figure into what we're talking about shortly. Now, Mrs. Motte, Rebecca Motte, I won't belabor this too much, but Mrs. Motte may have been the wealthiest woman in South Carolina at the time, largely because of the estate of her brother, Miles Bruton, and also the wealth of her husband, Jacob Motte. She had several residences. Fort Motte, for some reason, was built probably in the era 1779, 1780. We're not sure exactly why that location was chosen, but it was one of Jacob Motte's properties, so there you have it. And of course, a significant factor here is that she was not interested in living in Charleston under the British occupation after May 1780. So she and a large family entourage were living in this new mansion house when the British arrived, when they moved across the road and fortified the house. Now, basically what they did was they dug a deep ditch with a parapet all the way around the house. And you can see that the house fits pretty tightly into this fortification. There's not a lot of yard around this thing. And that's a significant factor later as well. This, by the way, was a drawing made by an American engineer immediately after the fort was captured. And here we have a painting of the great legend of Fort Motte, which is that when it became necessary to end the siege victoriously, because supposedly Rawdon's troops were on the way to save the British, Rebecca Motte offered a set of souvenir, a bow and arrow from the East Indies that a friend of her husband's or her brother had brought home. Now, we really don't know what was going on with that. There are 6 different versions of the story of how the Motte house was set on fire. That's 6 different 18th century versions. But here she is, she's offering, it looks like Francis Marion and certainly Light Horse Harry Lee. She's saying, okay, here are these arrows, and the bow is already on the ground there for some reason, and that's what's happening. They're saying, well, we think we might need to burn your house in order to effect this, so here you go. Now, as Brad mentioned, this is not a story that has an abundance of good primary sources. We've got basically Lee's account is the best account, and there are maybe a dozen other primary sources that really tell us something. But we don't have a lot of information. We don't have a period map that shows what the layout of the siege was. We don't know where the various units were placed. These things are not in the records. Lee's account is reasonably good, but it's not something you could draw a map of the battle with. Now, this evidence is interesting. This is from Benson Lossing's Field Book of the American Revolution, which was initially published in 1849. I believe it was 1847 when he visited the site, and he made these 2 drawings, which were engraved for his books. On the bottom is supposedly the Motte house. It doesn't look anything like the one drawn by the American engineer. And we don't know if the original house is still inside that edifice with all sorts of additions and alterations built on it, or if indeed the house was destroyed at some point. It was not destroyed at the time of the battle. The fire that we're about to talk about was put out. The other engraving there, the upper one, is Lossing's impression of the earthwork mound that remained from the American 6-pounder battery that figures in the siege. So that's about all we've got in terms of graphic evidence. We've got that engineer's drawing, and we've got these 2 things from 1847. Now, at some point, the DAR placed a monument where they thought the fort was. And as it turned out, the monument is in the middle of the fort. Now, years ago, that was not too much of a challenge because there were, before this was really thoroughly plowed in the 20th century, there were still brick mounds from the two major chimneys of this house site. And my guess is they either knew the location from tradition, because we're only talking about, I believe this is 1904 when they put this up. So they were only 2 or 3 generations from people who knew exactly where it was because they were alive during the Revolution. But in any case, they were in the right place. So here's what we knew. We knew that the monument was there. We had these drawings. That's about it, in addition to the written primary sources. Meanwhile, the battlefield is very much preserved by these individuals who just walked in the door. They were late, but they made it. Luther and Dorian Wanamaker are the owners and the preservers of Fort Motte. They have preserved a huge tract there that includes the entire battlefield, and they've always had a driving interest in preserving the site and the history of the site. And a couple of times a year I end up there giving some version of a talk like this because they have great events for friends on the site. So here they are, and there they are. Now, Luther got in touch with my colleague Steve Smith. Steve and I were already doing battlefield archaeology, Civil War sites and Revolutionary War sites alike. Luther and Steve spoke about what sort of project could be done to document the physical evidence of the siege of Fort Motte, because as we've just seen, there isn't much there. It's a big plowed field with a monument. Now, Steve was able to get a small grant from the National Park Service, one of those American Battlefield Protection Program grants. And those grants normally require you to identify pertinent features. So when you go to a battlefield that hasn't been thoroughly documented before, your job is to identify a list of pertinent features that still exist or that exist archaeologically in the ground. And that's what we did. And we made a list of things that we needed to find. These included verifying the Motte house, verifying the fortification around the house, the American siege approaches, which were more or less a formal European siege approach. We see the same thing at 96, for example. We see the same thing at Yorktown. These Vauban-style siege approaches, where you dig your way right up to the edge of the enemy fortifications before you do a storming operation or they surrender, one or the other. So we were looking for the American siege works. We also wanted to find the American 6-pounder battery. Now, the evidence for the siege was not going to be amazing. This was not Gettysburg. When I get to this, you'll see there are only 3 known dead from the entire siege. So there was a lot of firing, a lot of digging, but this was not a really ferocious battle. So we didn't expect a lot of physical evidence of the battle itself. The siege only lasted 6 days, 5.5, 6 days. The Americans approached, as I said, with formal siege works to get close enough to storm the fort. And as I mentioned, it came to this juncture where the Americans were afraid that Rawdon's army would march from Camden to relieve the fort. So the fort needed to be stormed or it needed to surrender. And as I mentioned, the tactic was to set fire to the house. Now this large frame house as you could see from that drawing earlier, occupied the interior of Fort Motte. There was very little empty space in there. If that house burned down, the entire garrison of 184 individuals who were packed in there would be roasted. So if the house was burning, the British would have to surrender. There was no choice. And as I said, there are roughly 6 versions of how that was done. But we're reasonably certain it was done by firing fire arrows from muskets or rifles. And that is the conclusion that Steve Smith arrived at in his new definitive history of the battle. And there are, I believe, 4 of the accounts say that the arrows were fired either with rifles or muskets. Now, a significant factor, incidentally, this is our first report. Our second report has been pending for a very long time, but here's the first one. This came out in, I believe, 07. So looking at some of these features of the siege, this is the only work that we've done on the ditch itself, the ditch at Fort Motte. I did this little section, and we wanted to generate a profile of what the ditch looked like, and that's what it looked like. So you can see that the engineer's drawing has been idealized. This was actually a pretty ugly ditch. It was a little deeper than we thought. It didn't have much in it. It had a couple of rifle balls in it because, of course, the earth that ended up in the ditch was the earth that was mounded up as the parapet on the outside of the ditch, or on the inside of the ditch, rather. So there's not a lot in there, and you can see the detail from the detail, and let's look at the top drawing, letter C down there. That is backfill that was not done by anybody. That's either from rain or just crumbling of the earth back into the ditch. And then almost immediately, the ditch is backfilled, probably with wheelbarrows and shovels. And that's what the bulk of the backfill is. So that's what the ditch is going to look like. And we have never been back to it. That would be a major undertaking. We'd need a big crew and lots of money, and that hasn't happened. Now, evidence for the house. There's the monument, and you can see where there used to be a brick pile that may have dictated the location of the monument, because there is a chimney base. And it has both 18th and 19th century artifacts in association, because the site was occupied into the mid-19th century. So there it is, and we ultimately found the opposing chimney. There were matching opposing chimneys that actually show up in the Lossing drawing from 1847. So there it is, right under the surface. Now the other thing we did, the other technique we used was large-scale systematic metal detecting. And I mean a lot of it, many, many acres of 100% very careful metal detecting, not just wandering around to see what we can find. In gray here are the areas that we have covered 100% with metal detecting. Now when I say 100%, I don't mean that we necessarily found 100% of the artifacts, but we tried. So the data is pretty good. And I will refer to a number of these areas in turn. The most significant data to me, the most amazing data, is right around Fort Motte itself. The red arrow points to the location of Fort Motte, which is now in this huge plowed field. So we were able to do a huge expanse of 100% metal detector coverage. And the main thing we found was a large quantity of rifle balls, fired rifle balls that were about 54 caliber, and a large quantity of musket balls, which were 75 caliber. So what we're looking at here, and I'll demonstrate it in a minute, is incoming fire from American riflemen, from Marion's riflemen. And we're looking at outgoing fire from Fort Motte using 75 caliber British muskets. So these are rifle balls. Now, you don't know yet what that red line is because I haven't told you yet. That's a secret. But obviously that's going to be the American siege works that we end up defining. So there's an obvious concentration of rifle balls on Fort Motte. You know, it's not as clean as it might be, but it's pretty obvious. And these are 75 caliber British musket balls. The ones that are open circles in the fort are unfired examples. So this is pretty obvious what's going on here. We've got outgoing fire from British troops with 75 caliber muskets shooting at the siege approach and losing unfired balls in the fort. Now I should point out that this was all done after many years of metal detecting by collectors. So we're looking at a ghost of the material. You know, I'm not saying we've got most of it. I'm saying we might have 10% of it because it had been metal detected to death. But if you use the techniques that Steve and I use, you can still get that ghost. You can still get that representative remnant and map it, and you can see things like this. Now this is obviously a valid distribution, this and this. And I have to say, having done archaeology for 48 years, this is one of the most satisfying results that I've ever seen. It's normally not like this. You have historical sources, you think you know what you're looking for, you find interesting things, but it doesn't fit together very well. You know, it's like, well, okay, that must be where it is, but you know, who knows? It's usually much more ambiguous. I know Wayne would agree. It just doesn't fit as well as you'd like it to. But this is to me, this is you know, couldn't be better, this agreement. And of course it got a lot better once we were able to draw the siege works on the map. And this is a view from roughly the extremity of the siege works toward Fort Motte. So you can see they were fairly close. They were certainly close enough to shoot fire arrows onto the roof. Now, we wanted to find those siege works. That was one of the major components. We wanted to see that because we thought, well, we wanted to see exactly where it came from. We wanted to see how it was made, and we wanted to see what was in it. This was my first effort to do that. I dug a series of these nice shovel trenches perpendicular to where it should have been. And I was completely defeated by dry, hot May weather at Fort Motte, which it did two things. It made the surface the consistency of concrete, and it also dried out the features. Now, if you have any familiarity with archaeological excavation, you know that you have earth features, which are basically discolorations in the ground anywhere that the ground, the ancient soil, has been disturbed. So we were looking at where the siege approach ditch would cross these things on the perpendicular, and we couldn't see it. We knew it was there, but we couldn't see it because it was just totally baked out. So there was much suffering that attended this operation. However, Luther provided a larger, more effective shovel. And we very quickly found the siege approach. We found it in 5 or 6 different locations with 5 or 6 ditches. I've forgotten the exact number now, but, and here's an example. Now, of course, I've cleaned this up with a trowel, but that's one of the ditches that Luther's operator cut for us, and it was immediately apparent that we had this soil feature in the ditch. And as I said, we repeated that 5 or 6 times. So we had the run of the ditch. We knew where it was coming from. We knew the angle and so forth. But we still didn't know exactly what it looked like in terms of interior detail. But that's it. That is, I should have mentioned that while Marion's command was largely engaged in rifle fire to suppress Fort Mott, Lee's men were engaged in digging these siege works, and they were assisted by a large contingent of impressed or kidnapped, perhaps, plantation slaves. And they worked 24 hours a day to dig this thing across the field to Fort Mott. So there was the first one I cleaned up and said, okay, this is what we're looking for. And here's a nice messy shot in hot weather of me cleaning that up and making it bigger. Okay, here you can see the Traco ditch is the diagonal thing in the foreground. And this is actually the same location as the previous photo. I decided to go ahead and clean out a piece of this the first year that we saw it, and that's what we got done the first year. So you've got the Traco ditch, and then the vertical part is the ditch that Lee's command dug. I didn't dig that. All I did was take the fill out of it. And in a minute I'll show you how that wasn't really so difficult. It sounds like it would be impossible, but it was actually real easy, except that it was rock hard. And here again, here's a view from that ditch to Fort Mott. And here we are in the next season. I've done a much larger exposure, but we can still see the Traco ditch in the foreground. And again, this is exactly what Lee's people dug. The irregularities and the curving walls and so forth are not because I didn't have any instruments to lay it out with. Those irregularities were cut in 1781 by the people doing the work. So that's exactly what they dug. Now, this is how I was able to excavate it. I think you can probably see that the ancient subsoil on the bottom and left and right is a consistent red color. But that wall, which is an artificial profile that I've cleaned, is not. It's got all kinds of little lenses in it and so forth. It also had a different texture. It was somewhat less concrete-like than the ancient soil. So it was fairly simple to excavate this thing down to exactly what was dug in 1780. Now, this seems like it's probably not deep enough. I think it's 80 or 90 centimeters deep. So it's not really much of a siege work, and it seems like it wouldn't be very safe from fire from Fort Mott, because it was certainly dug under fire. But we think that the top of the hill there has probably lost at least a foot of soil to sheet erosion from plowing. So we can add maybe another foot to the modern surface, and you can see there's still a plow zone there. A plow zone, by the way, is the modern soil that's been completely annihilated in terms of any integrity, any archaeological integrity, and that's the band on top. So that's your topsoil that gets plowed every year. Everything below that is untouched. Now, we still wanted a better picture of this thing. We initially tried ground penetrating radar, and the version that we tried in 2004 did not work. It didn't even show Fort Mott, which was absurd to me, because I've seen, even at that time, I'd seen amazing radar results. And so the ditch of Fort Mott didn't show up from the initial effort. But we came back. John Leader, the ex-state archaeologist, had a new gradiometer system that he thought might work. And here is that system in operation. Gradiometer is a complex technology, but basically what it looks at is iron in the soil. Almost all soils have some iron, and the iron. Now this is a gross oversimplification, but I wouldn't understand it anyway if I said any more. Iron in the soil in ancient soil is aligned. It's aligned on the magnetic poles, the microscopic crystals. And when you dig a hole in that and mix those crystals up, it leaves a magnetic signature that's different. And that's what we're looking at here. So this was the initial effort, and it shows Fort Motte. We went back the next year and did the whole thing. So there's Fort Motte, and there are the American siege approaches. And I should point out that we didn't go any further north because that is where the landform breaks and falls away very rapidly. So that's the edge of the hill there where we quit work. Now, there was no point in going any further because the Americans involved in the siege would have been in total defilade beyond that point. They were not going to get hit from Fort Motte. But there it is. And as I mentioned, that enabled us to do this. We already had the metal detecting data, and we were able to apply it to these maps. Now, another feature, as I mentioned, that we wanted to try to find was the American 6-pounder battery. This is Lossing's view of it. These are canister balls. The 6-pounder battery ended up being fairly important, even though it was only a single gun, because when the roof caught on fire, the British swarmed all over the roof trying to put the fire out. And the American 6-pounder gun began firing canister rounds at the roof. And they were discouraged from fighting the fire any further and surrendered. And that's there. The mound that we're talking about is there where the red arrow is. And this is what it looked like when we were able to verify that it was there. It was knocked down in a clear cut in the 80s, but it's still there. The base of it is still there. It's still obviously an artificial mound in the woods. And the weirdest thing, the day that we began metal detecting on this thing, Steve Smith found a 6-pound solid shot, which really shouldn't have been there because they weren't firing solid shot. And it's a solid shot without the rest of the iron straps that should be with it in an unfired cartridge. So we really don't know why there was a bare 6-pounder cannonball in the middle of this battery, but it served to tell us that this was indeed the right location. These are artifacts from that location, just a selection. There was a lot of hardware, a lot of lead shot, and there's the cannonball. We also cut a section through the mound on a level, and here you can see my trowel is way down in the prehistoric soil. It's about a foot deep in the prehistoric soil, the ancient soil. That gray band running across the top of it is the 1781 ground surface that's left that gray stain. And the mottled stuff above that to the surface, to the modern surface, is part of the fill of the mound that they prepared for the 6-pounder gun. Now, here's Mrs. Motte again with her arrows. Another one of the sites we wanted to verify was the farmhouse that the Motte entourage retreated to when the British took over her mansion. And this is supposedly what it looked like. It seems unlikely because that wouldn't have been common architecture at that time in the mid-18th century in South Carolina. But in any case, there it is. This is the old farmhouse where Mrs. Motte and her family and her servants were living. And here it is on the Cook map of 1773 where it says Lloyd, almost in the middle of the image. The Lloyds were among the earliest settlers in this part of the colony, and that was their house. So we knew that if we were able to find this house, that it would not be a 1780s looking occupation. It should be a mid-18th century occupation. it should look like people lived there in the 50s and 60s, 1750s and 60s, and not at the time of the Revolution. And that's what we found. Now, on this image, Fort Motte would be, I don't know, just a couple of inches below where it says Lloyd. But of course it wasn't there in 1773. And the red arrow shows where we did find it. And it was overwhelmingly positive. There was a tremendous bunch of material in the plow zone where this house existed. And if any of you have been to the site, this is only about 150 feet maybe from the Devil's Footprint feature, the rock feature there, also preserved by the Wanamaker's. We did a little bit of testing, and here's a sample of artifacts on that site. And this is indeed a good group of mid-century artifacts. Some of them go later than that, some go earlier, but this is not what I would expect if this was a new house in 1780. This was the old farmhouse that figures in the accounts. We found several camps, a total of 3 camps that we don't think were associated with structures. We think they were bivouac camps related to Fort Motte. The first one is this one down at the very bottom where the red arrow is. No idea who this was. We found all different calibers of musket ammunition and rifle ammunition and buckshot and civilian buttons from the period. No military buttons, but as you can see, it covers a huge area, big dispersed area. It could have been the Loyalist contingent that was at Fort Motte was camped there. It could have been Marion's camp during the siege. It could have even been a camp from 1781, from the Utah Springs campaign. In any case, we were unable to identify it, and we found no military buttons, so no telling who was there. But we also found this. Part of that camp, just a small area of that camp, had about 25 or 30 late war federal Civil War artifacts. And this was a picket post from the 55th Massachusetts Colored Infantry, which in June of 1865, right after the end of the war, was sent to Orangeburg on occupation duty. And they sent 2 companies of the regiment to Fort Motte Station, which is about a mile down the railroad from our site. And clearly they had a picket post near Fort Motte. And this is really kind of overlooking the river, by the way. So that's what this is. This is late war ammunition. I have no problem with that being what it is. Number 19 there is another camp. Again, no military diagnostics. We had both British and American musket calibers, lots of buckshot, lots of 18th century civilian buttons, and odds and ends like the nose cap from a rifle, not a musket, but a rifle. Again, this could be Marion's camp during the siege, or it could be Loyalists camped adjacent to Fort Motte. Finally, we found a little camp that was indeed diagnostic. And if you look, we're looking downhill from where the beginning of the siege works would have been. And that's what this is. This ended up being a very small camp at the base of the steep slope below where the siege works began and then moved south at Fort Motte. Does that orientation make sense? So we're looking at a camp that relates directly to the siege operation. It's probably where people slept, cooked, whatever, during the excavation. And again, this would have been Lee's men, Light Horse Harry Lee's men. Now normally, if you do a lot of camping, you know that a fairly steep slope is not particularly comfortable to camp on, but this one was. We found evidence of campfires, we found melted lead, all kinds of small arms ammunition, and nails and other odds and ends. Here is a 1772 George III halfpenny. And last but not least, the most amazing single artifact that I think I've ever encountered in doing this work. In that little camp, we found an iron arrowhead. This was made by cutting off and beating out the shaft of a wrought nail, I believe. They just beat it flat and then sharpened it into a point, which is a technique that I've been able to find in a couple of other places in the world. It's an easy way to make an iron arrowhead. But I don't normally find iron arrowheads in South Carolina. I have no other explanation for this arrowhead other than this is one of the arrows that was prepared to shoot at the roof of Fort Mott. Now, we could have worked there for 50 years and not found this thing. So I'm very happy that we were actually able to find something that diagnostic from the siege of Fort Mott. Now, as I said, we have no historic map of the siege of Fort Mott, but we now have this one. This is the map we did for the exhibit next door, and I think it still pretty much fits. We don't see an American perimeter on the left because that's actually a fairly steep slope, so I don't have any Americans over there. But these other areas where I say Marion, I have the Marion label, there's ammunition, there's 18th century buttons and so forth, just scattered up all through there. So they were very likely on the tree line, wherever the tree line was. And then I show where the American battery is actually located. And I've left the trees out of the way because, of course, they would have needed a line of sight. So I've got to finish up here. In closing, my colleague Steve Smith recently published the definitive history of this battle, and actually also Fort Watson. He treated them as a single campaign. You'll be hard pressed to find additional detail anywhere about these two actions. There's Steve with a canister ball from Fort Mott. He threatened to come today, and I said, please don't, because I don't need the world's authority on Fort Mott to question my history. The archaeology's fine, but I'm not comfortable telling Steve anything about the history of Fort Mott. So anyway, by way of advertisement, I do have a few copies of that for sale, if anybody wants one. Now, I've tried to save a little bit of time for questions.
Jim, what does this work provide you personally with in terms of the personal sense of satisfaction that you get from uncovering this kind of history?
Well, this one worked out well. As I suggested, I've done a lot of projects that were just, well, okay, we've got this stuff. What does it mean? but this one, we were able to rebuild the battlefield essentially. If you go there, there's a monument and a huge field. And if you read about it in a book and you drove up there with Luther's permission, you'd say, well, okay, where are things? Now, as a result of this, Luther has actually marked the battlefield. If you go there now, you'll think you're on a state or a federal park because he has got markers and interpretive panels scattered around the property to interpret the battle. So I'm very pleased with that. Very pleased with that result.
How about the metal detectors? To what extent have they helped you in your work?
It's been overwhelming. I began doing formal metal detector work in the 80s, even before the Little Bighorn project made it a big deal. And Steve and I have done more of that than anything else. It's also very affordable. he and I can just go out and do a project with our own salaries, basically. Whereas if you're going to do a major excavation, like if we wanted to excavate the entire moat of Fort Mott, we would need $200,000. So, and it gives you the information you need pretty quickly. It really is quick and dirty, but it's good empirical evidence.
Can you tell me where exactly is this? I mean,
Yeah, in fact, there we go, I got it. So there's the Wateree coming down and joining the Congaree. So this is about 30 miles east of here, slightly southeast, but mainly east, where the Wateree and the Congaree converge. So
Highway
if
601.
it's, yeah, 601 crosses just a little bit to the left of the old road there. And I should point out too that probably during the Great Flood of I believe 1855, if I'm not mistaken, the big meander there that goes up to McCord's Ferry was cut off. So the river now just curves right around the top of the Fort Mott landform. That big meander is now a big oxbow lake that's stranded. And you can see that when you take the 601 bridge, which as you may know, it takes, it must be 1.5 miles to get across that bridge. It's a tremendous bridge.
Is this kind of on the southeast corner outside of Congaree National Park?
Yeah,
It'd be up to the left?
yeah, the left and up is almost all park.
South is a paper mill.
Just across the river.
Yeah, it's south of the Congaree.
if we were to take 378 out and then take a right on to 601,
Correct.
okay.
Yeah,
All Bluff Road.
Okay, yes.
yeah,
thank you.
yeah. We usually just take Bluff Road
Okay.
because it's more direct.
All right.
Yeah, and there's not really much there. I mean, it's extremely rural. There's still several plantations that are reasonably intact properties. Fort Mott itself, there is a little crossroads village that's called Fort Mott. That used to be the Fort Mott Railroad Station, and that's where that historic jail is, the preserved jail that you'll see online if you look for Fort Mott. But that's not where Fort Mott is located. Fort Mott is a mile or so up the road at that location.
Point to where the town, the jail town area you're talking about?
Yeah, it's
Where
to
is it with regard to the actual fort?
it's to the southwest
Okay.
of Fort Mott. It's down the railroad, and the railroad comes in just to the right of the farmhouse and then curves back around to the southwest, if I'm not mistaken.
So if we get to Orange Road, we went too far.
Yeah, yeah.
You can't miss it going up that big bridge. You really appreciate the cliff where Fort Mott and everything.
Yeah, the cliffs here are amazing. It's hard to believe
200 foot from
yeah.
there on one side.
It's hard to believe you're on the coastal plain when you see those cliffs.
McCord's Ferry, has that been researched and?
I have always wanted to do that, and on many rides back and forth, I've said to Steve, why don't we try to find McCord's Ferry, because it's been isolated. You know, it's been forgotten obviously since the meander was cut off. It's meaningless, and they built a bridge, so it doesn't mean anything. We do know that at least briefly the British had a redoubt at McCord's Ferry, and I've always wanted to go look for it. And I know you know that part of the country reasonably well, so maybe you can find out who owns it.
I do, yeah.
Okay.
That's something really.
To help everyone out, there's on 601, as part of the national park, there is Bates Ferry Trailhead. And that essentially is about 150 yards south of McCord's Ferry, right off. There's a trailhead there. You can walk essentially that red line, and the park has put up interpretive panels that talk about the battle, and you can walk right right up to the.
I've never seen that.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I've never seen that
So-
one.
If you look at Santee River down there, that's basically the upper end of Lake Marion,
Yeah,
where it says Santee.
yeah, it's no longer with us.
Well,
I have a,
Yeah.
I have a bunch of dumb questions, but so since you mentioned, so this is somebody's property, so we need to get permission from the person, or how does that work? Or is it like a state park, or?
I don't.
I'm interested in going, is I'm trying to figure out how to, is it a state park, we can just walk on the property, we need somebody's permission
No.
to get on the property, or?
You kind of have to know Luther.
You have to what?
You kind of have to know Luther.
Is that Luther Wanamaker? I'm right here.
Oh, like
Oh,
that.
yeah, do that. But, Jim, one of the things that Steve found that was so incredible was the thought of, we're talking about elder keys. And,
Oh,
that
yeah.
was one of the earlier things that he was so excited about. I think he found the class. And Rebecca was famous for having keys around her belt. And, so they found that and, so forth. But,
Yeah, it's a little brass chatelaine
we all
with
have
hooks on it.
On Saturday, June 16th. I'm sorry, thank you, honey. June 13th, it's Saturday at 10 o'clock to about 1. We're having a sort of a revisit of the great picnic that they had in 1809, or was it 1909? The monument was put up in 1906 by the DAR, but in 1909, they had a picnic, and there weren't too many cars, but they used horses and things, and had a great picnic with 300 people, and we're hoping to have another 300 people. But this Saturday, so please come if you can, and you'll see the whole, both hilltops and everything, and we're delighted. We're gonna have, a lady, Margaret Pickett is gonna talk as a historian, and, we'll have, Steve will be there with them, with some of the people, including the Captain Ball and the Ara. The Ara it was an absolute miracle that they found that Ara, isn't it?
Yes. Yes, indeed.
Is the causeway from the 18th century still intact?
I've never been down in there. Now you can see the road until it gets right out to the river, and then I've never tried to walk across the floodplain. Of course, there were times of the year when, as you know, the Congaree is pretty deep there. I mean, it floods the banks completely, and they must have had a system where they pulled boats up the road to get to the ferry itself. But I've never seen any reference to how that was done. But they had to have a boat system to float to the ferry.
James, could you tell us real quick about the Devil's Footprint?
Yeah, I know a little bit about it. I'm
Okay.
sure Luther knows more, but it's just an odd sandstone feature that sticks out right at the edge of the cliff there on the northernmost landform.
So where would that be on the map?
Okay, right where it says farmhouse, immediately on the other side of the north-south dirt road that runs to the right of the farmhouse. Luther has a marker. He's got an interpretive panel and a little fence, and he keeps it mowed. And there's a big sandstone block sticking out of the edge of the bluff there before the cliff starts. And it has what looks like a footprint in it.
Right.
The legend, this is one of those legends that has several retellings in the 19th century before it becomes really distilled down to a
Right.
good story. But the version that you often see, which you can find readily online, is that the Lloyds were a pious couple living in this little farmhouse. And one evening they had a visitor, dressed in black, and they entertained this visitor And Mr. Lloyd and the visitor stayed up all night, and the visitor tried to take Mr. Lloyd's faith.
Right.
And of course, we know who the visitor was. Meanwhile, I believe Mrs. Lloyd was, for some reason, reading the Bible backwards in order to counter this threat.
Right.
You know, how that makes sense, I don't know. But anyway, so ultimately, the devil got disgusted and fed up, and he flew out the door, and in a single bound, he went from the house and landed on this rock,
Right.
and then bounded all the way across the congaree and was never seen again. And of course, the footprint in the rock is where the devil
Right.
landed before he went across the river, which is all well and good. It's one of the best early South Carolina folklore stories. But interestingly, when we excavated there, we found several pieces of brass Bible casing, like book casing, from a brass
Right.
bound leather Bible, which I thought was kind of amusing.
Right.
So we have pieces of Mr. Lloyd's Bible.
Thank you. Excuse me, I'm just gonna put an official end to it, and everybody can stay, and he's willing to
Yeah, I'm
answer
here.
questions as long as you have them.